Your cardinal picked the wrong branch, and a snake found the nest 3 days later, not because the parents were careless. They built where the leaves gave decent cover. And it wasn't enough, because the danger wasn't coming from above at all. Most people assume any hidden spot will do. Nobody ever told them that one decision determines almost everything that happens next. Subscribe to Bird Sense right now. This is exactly the kind of thing we uncover every week. And what actually decided whether that nest survived the season long before a single egg was laid? That is what changes everything. To understand what he is actually doing, you have to understand how much weight rides on nest site selection before the birds involved even seem to be doing much of anything. Cardinals typically build low, often just a few feet off the ground in dense shrubs, and that height range puts them squarely inside the hunting territory of the animals responsible for the largest share of nest failures across North America. Rat snakes, black snakes, and other climbing predators built specifically to move through exactly this kind of low, tangled cover. Across long-term nest monitoring studies, predation consistently accounts for the majority of nest failures in songbirds, and snakes are frequently the single most common predator identified at failed nests. The site gets chosen in roughly a day, sometimes less. The consequences of that choice can run for weeks. Here is where it gets strange. A snake does not find a nest by sight in the way a hawk does. It finds it primarily by scent, following chemical trails left by the adult bird's repeated visits. The same path in, the same path out, the same branches touched dozens of times a day as parents deliver food. A nest tucked into dense cover with a single, consistent approach route is, from a snake's perspective, easier to locate than a more exposed nest with scattered, unpredictable access points because the scent trail concentrates instead of spreading. The very behavior that looks like protection to a human observer, thick leaves, a hidden interior, parents sticking to the same careful path, can be quietly building the exact scent corridor a snake needs to follow straight to the eggs, which means the nest that looked safest to you, tucked deep in a shrub where you could barely see it yourself, may have been broadcasting its location the entire time, just not in a way either of you could detect. Cardinals have no mechanism for smelling their own scent trail the way a predator smells it. They cannot audit the path they've been taking to and from the nest, cannot recognize that 4 days of identical visits have created a corridor a snake can follow with very little effort. The birds are running the best defense their instincts have ever given them, and that defense was built almost entirely around threats that arrive by air or by sight, not threats that arrive by tracking scent along the ground and up through the branches. Most people across the country, watching from a porch in Tennessee or a backyard in Missouri, discover a raided nest and assume something violent and sudden happened. A single dramatic event. In most snake predation cases, it isn't dramatic at all. A black rat snake can consume an entire clutch of eggs or a full brood of nestlings in one visit, methodically, without a struggle loud enough to draw attention, often at night or during the quiet hours. When the parents have briefly left the nest unattended, there is frequently no sign afterward beyond an empty nest. No scattered shell fragments, no obvious struggle. Just absence where there used to be eggs or chicks, and no way for the parents to understand what happened or why. No lesson they can carry forward into the next attempt. But researchers found something they did not expect when they compared nest survival rates across different site characteristics within the same habitat. It isn't simply height, and it isn't simply how hidden the nest looks to a human eye. The strongest predictor of snake predation in several studies was the density and continuity of the vegetation connecting the nest to the ground. Thick, unbroken climbing paths of vines, dense shrub branches, or overlapping foliage that a snake can move through without exposing itself. Nests with even a small physical gap in that connective cover, a few feet of open space, a snake would have to cross visibly, showed meaningfully lower predation rates than nests with an unbroken climbing route straight to the eggs, even when the two nests were otherwise similarly hidden and similarly high, built by parents who had no way of knowing which shrub had that critical break in it and which one didn't, which means the outcome for that specific nest in your yard was likely decided by something almost nobody consciously evaluates, not how well hidden the nest looked, but how connected it was to the ground by continuous, climbable cover. A cardinal choosing between two nearly identical-looking shrubs has no way to assess that difference. There is no visible cue separating a shrub with a clean climbing path from one with an accidental gap in its structure. The birds are making one of the most consequential decisions of their entire breeding season based on criteria, shade, density, general concealment that only partially overlap with the actual risk they are trying to avoid, using the only information their senses were ever built to gather in a single afternoon of scouting that carries consequences for the entire season ahead. Here is where it gets even stranger, and where the story stops being only a lesson about what can go wrong. Researchers studying nest predation in residential and semi-residential habitats have found that certain landscaping choices measurably shift these odds, and not in ways that require major yard changes. Shrubs and small trees planted with some physical separation from taller trees, fences, or continuous hedgerows, breaking up exactly the kind of unbroken climbing corridors snakes rely on, correspond with somewhat lower rates of snake-related nest predation in the studies that have looked at it. So does keeping brush piles and dense ground cover a reasonable distance from a yard's primary nesting shrubs, since brush piles are also prime snake habitat and shelter, and a nest sitting close to one is effectively sitting next to a predator's front door, which means the next time you're deciding where to plant a new shrub, whether to let a vine climb unchecked up the side of an existing one, or whether to leave a small brush pile sitting directly beneath your best nesting cover, you are making a decision with more weight to it than it appears to carry. You cannot guarantee any nest's safety. No yard is predator-proof, and cardinals have been navigating this exact threat successfully for longer than your property has existed. But a few feet of intentional separation between dense shrubs and the structures that let something climb into them is one of the only variables in this entire story that a person standing in their own backyard actually has some control over. A gap between a nesting shrub and the fence line it backs up against, a few feet of open lawn between the shrub and the nearest brush pile, trimming back a vine before it turns two separate plants into one continuous climbing path. None of it requires removing habitat or making a yard less welcoming to birds overall. It simply means thinking about connection, not just concealment, the next time you're choosing where something dense gets to grow right up against something else. The cardinal who picked the wrong branch this year did not fail. He made the best decision his instincts could offer him against a threat built specifically to exploit exactly the kind of caution that instinct produces. The next nest, in the next shrub, in your yard or somewhere close to it, gets a slightly better chance. Every time a person decides that where things connect matters as much as how well they're hidden,